Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the lovely and talented Gwen Ifill, and we're going to set her up. We're going to set her up very nicely. You know, the highest calling of the First Amendment is to protect the sphere of political debate, and we're delighted to welcome Gwen Ifill to moderate our panel on the freedom of speech in the political arena. Ifill is the managing editor and moderator of Washington Week and is a senior correspondent for NewsHour. She serves on the board of the Harvard Institute of Politics, the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Museum of Television and Radio, and the University of Maryland's Philip Merrill College of Journalism. In October 2004, Gwen Ifill moderated the vice presidential debate here in Cleveland between Republican Dick Cheney and Democrat John Edwards, and the 2008 debate between Democrat Senator Joe Biden and Republican Governor Sarah Palin for the vice presidency. Her book, The Breakthrough: Politics and Race in the Age of Obama, looks at several African-American politicians, including Barack Obama. Ladies and gentlemen, Gwen Ifill.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be back in Cleveland again. Cleveland rocks.
Yes.
I come here and to share with you the kind of conversation I like to have on Friday nights, where I hope that you're watching and listening and thinking to yourself, I'd like to have dinner with those people. When people fight and are uncivil and spit at each other, you don't really want to have them over to your house, do you? What we have is a great panel which is going to be civil and smart and engaging and expand on the topics we've already touched on here today. Free speech is not just standing up and talking. It's not just shouting fire in a crowded theater, and it's not just fighting without some sort of sense of resolution. What we're going to talk about here today is free speech in the media. And when I use the term media in a broad sense, in terms of what the law says and also what the practice of our craft means. Starting on my far right, we have Brad Smith, who's a former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. Federal Elections Commission. I wrote down FEC and said FCC. We love alphabets in Washington. And to his left is Peter Baker, former colleague of mine, who's correspondent at the New York Times, based in Washington. To his left is Susan Glasser, who's the editor of Foreign Policy magazine. And then to my right is Bruce Sanford, who's a media lawyer at Baker and Hostetler, and I just learned a former 10-year resident of Cleveland. So he's going to make lots of Cleveland suck-up comments as we're here today, which I know you'll appreciate. One of the things we're going to talk about here today is our experiences with this line between free speech and civility, and how it plays out not only in the law, what the law had in mind, what Washington has in mind, but also what the media, however you define that to mean, has in mind. I spend a lot of time traveling to college campuses, and I get a couple of questions. The first is, what did it feel like to have Queen Latifah play you on Saturday Night Live? The answer, great. The other question I get is, how do you restrain your opinion? You're on television and you're interviewing these people, and you must disagree with them sometime. How do you restrain that? And the question, of course, in the larger media environment is, do you restrain it? Or how were you brought up in this business to think that restraint was even necessary or valued or good? So I want to start with Peter Baker and talk about that a little bit, whether this is just something that I have experienced or something you have as well.
No, I agree with you entirely. And first of all,
that's a good way to start a question.
Always. I have to say, on Friday nights, the key to getting a good slot on Friday nights is to always agree with Gwen. Thank you all for having us here. I'm also had 2 years living in the Cleveland area. It's college nearby at Oberlin. It's great to be back. And in fact, your question is a good one. How do you restrain your own opinions? We spend our lives as journalists interviewing people with very strongly held points of view. And one thing that they in particular have a hard time understanding is how it is that you can't have those or might not have those, because in fact in their lives they view life through the lens of my philosophy is this and somebody else's philosophy is that. In journalism, our goal at most is to understand what those philosophies are, not to share in them necessarily. And the one thing I've learned, I think, in 25 years of doing this is that there are very few simple answers. And almost everybody has a point of view that has has some validity to it, even if I wouldn't personally agree with it, that they're coming from a very good faith, good-hearted, often very well-reasoned point of view that deserves airing, and that it's my job to help them explain that to a larger audience, even if the larger audience might or might not agree with them.
Brad, let me ask you to jump in on this, because one of the interesting things I find, one of the places we have this debate most often in Washington involves the Supreme Court. And there was a case last year, for instance, involving the Westboro Baptist Church in Kansas. And they are the people who go and picket funerals of military officers. I think I heard the other day they tweeted that they were going to picket Steve Jobs' funeral, and they used an iPhone to send the tweet. So the question, though, however, I'm not making that up, but the truth is the court came down on their side in a way that a lot of people would find to be pretty awful, people who love the troops and love the sacrifice, and say, why are these people allowed to speak?
Well, I think this has come to the idea that ultimately you need to have a sort of a prophylactic barrier there that protects things that are very sometimes ugly in order to protect the things that we all recognize as being core to the First Amendment and really important. And there's going to be a constant problem of line drawing, but there's a feeling that if you start to chip away at that outer circle of speech that's not very nice, pornography or topless dancing as a form of expression or cursing on television or the Westboro Baptist Church protest, that eventually you endanger that core speech at the center. So, building some tolerance for that type of more inflammatory speech at the edges really protects what the First Amendment is most precious to us for.
Bruce, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think we're seeing at the Supreme Court a reinvigoration of the First Amendment protection for offensive speech. Chief Justice Roberts, in the case you're talking about, Gwen, writes a wonderful, I'm even going to read it because I can't memorize it, conclusion to the court's opinion in that case. And he says, speech is powerful. It can stir people to action, move them to tears of both joy and sorrow, and as it did here, inflict great pain. On the facts before us, we cannot react to that pain by punishing the speech. As a nation, we have chosen a different course to protect even hurtful speech on public issues to ensure that we do not stifle public debate. That is language that echoes Justice Brennan's language in the Texas versus Johnson, the flag-burning decision in 1989. So more than 20 years later, we have Chief Justice Roberts, certainly not of the same political persuasion of Justice Brennan, but saying First Amendment protection for speech that really hurts us, offends us, disgusts us, brutalizes us, deserves First Amendment protection. Now, you don't see that kind of political divide on the Supreme Court that you see in Congress or the executive branch.
It was 8-1, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So there wasn't one of these famous 5-4 split court decisions.
No, exactly. You can, the one justice who in the Snyder versus Phelps case saw something he didn't like, and that was what he called the brutalization of the victim, was Justice Alito. He's not signed down to what I would call the Brennan Chief Justice Roberts theme of First Amendment protection for outrageous speech. He's not there yet. But most of the other ones are in one way or another.
Susan, let's expand this, because I was driving through Cleveland this weekend and saw 100-plus people marching down the street. It was the Occupy Cleveland protest. And it was part of the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Philadelphia. It's happening all over the country. And there has been some discussion in the last 24, 48 hours that this is our Arab Spring. Now, you spend a lot of time looking at this issue beyond our borders. And I wonder if you think that's true.
Well, I think it's an interesting comparison, especially if you look at sort of economic troubled times and how they breed political unrest, not only in the Arab world, but look at all across Europe today. And I think that's where you might see an even better analogy in some ways is to the protesters in Greece or in Spain or in Britain, where austerity measures, of course, have led people in the streets. But I'm also struck by what are the consequences. We talk about free speech here, but then we talk, as Bruce just pointed out, in the enormous consensus that actually does exist about what should be fair game in American public space. And the answer is quite a lot. And the people in the Arab Spring, the people in many countries around the world, in Mexico today, in Russia, when you talk about free speech there, you're talking about a very different set of political debates. You're talking about countries where reporters really put their lives on the line in order to unearth information that powerful forces in the society, whether drug cartels or oligarchs, don't want them to publish. You're talking about, political graffiti appearing on the side of walls, and that's what sparked the round of protests in Syria that have been met with tanks. And something like more than 2,000 people killed so far in Syria, according to the United Nations, to suppress that. So, I'm frankly very wary when people make these analogies. We have a broad consensus in American society, and thank goodness for that, that our speech is protected. But these people arguably are fighting for their rights, and just as the flowering of free speech under Gorbachev in the Soviet Union was sort of a precursor in many ways to the revolution, the peaceful revolution that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. You can see that happening in the Arab world, that all of a sudden that which was forbidden has become possible, and it is a great flowering of speech. In Egypt, hundreds of newspapers have opened in the last 6 months. They say print is dead, but apparently not in Cairo. And so, this is intimately connected with free speech, but the consequences in those countries still remain, of much more serious nature.
You and Peter, and full disclosure, Peter and Susan are married, so I can say this, were with both correspondents in Moscow for the Washington Post. And watching that play out, watching this play out now and watching what you saw, especially the restrictions on the press and coverage, do you see it very differently now?
Yes, I think so. I think that what we saw when we were in Russia shows that this moment of hope and optimism in a place like the Arab world should be greeted with some measured reaction, because it doesn't necessarily lead to the place we think it's going to lead or hope it might lead in terms of a permanent flowering of democracy or institutions that would preserve the freedoms we're talking about. In Russia, we saw a real backlash to what happened when Yeltsin stood on the tank. And today, 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, you see great ambivalence in Russian society as to what happened there, and you see a leadership in Prime Minister about to be President Putin again, that is interested in keeping control and consolidating power. In Moscow today, they have a series of protests they try to have from time to time, once a month, and every time they seem to be met by police and carted away. Strangely enough, the Kremlin-sponsored youth groups that have protests, the demonstrations in favor of the government, never seem to have any problem with getting permits and getting permission from the authorities to protest. So we should remember today, as we help and hope and talk with the Arab youth who are building their new societies, that there's a lot of hard work ahead to get to where we hope, and they hope, I think, that they would like to be.
Well,
go ahead.
In China, for example, the Arab Spring has provoked one of the biggest crackdowns on free speech of the last 2 decades, really since Tiananmen Square. It's been a massive increase in what's known as the Great Firewall of China, even to the extent that when the initial revolution was occurring in Tunisia, the Chinese went out of their way to ban all use of the word jasmine, because it was being called the Jasmine Revolution. And if you ever go to China, you see the women on the streets selling the jasmine blossoms. They were told, no, you can't do that anymore, even on the streets. And there was this incredible Wall Street Journal story that went and talked to these little ladies who are the street vendors. And they said, do you know why you can't sell that? And they said, no, we're not sure. We heard it's a bad harvest this year. That's the length to which a government that is not like ours will go to suppress speech.
I would just say, Gwen, this takes us back to your initial question about Westboro Baptist Church. What Peter was saying is you've got to decide, do you trust the government to make these decisions as to who's a valid protester and who's not? I mean, the Westboro Baptist Church can be viewed as offensive speech toward the victims' families or toward the deceased families, but it can also be viewed as anti-government speech, and that's exactly what we want to prevent.
Well, let me ask you to follow, because another one of the definitions of speech is political speech. And we, in Washington, we've been suffering through a lot of toxic-seeming political speech. People yelling at people from the floor of the House, you name it. There are a couple questions which we'll get to in a moment about whether this is anything brand new. But let's talk about political speech as speech. For instance, I think about Citizens United. You're former chairman of the FEC, Brad. You know that for a long time there's been this ongoing discussion through many Supreme Court cases about what constitutes speech, whether money constitutes speech, whether You name it. And Citizens United was a perfect case, and you had a hand in that. So make the connection for us between political speech, money, and what freedom really means in this case.
Well, sure. I mean, the first point is that money is necessary to facilitate political speech. That is to say, some people say, well, it's not speech at all, it's giving money, but imagine if we said, well, the New York Times can't spend more than $1,000 a year to publish. I mean, it's gone. Imagine if,
close.
That's right. Imagine if the City Club couldn't pay to bring, us, this panel here. I mean, we wouldn't be speaking. If we couldn't rent this hall, you wouldn't be listening, you wouldn't get a chance to ask questions. So if you limit speech for the purpose of limiting politics, you have a First Amendment problem there. Then the question is whether there are other reasons why the government ought to be able to put limitations on people's speech. The Supreme Court has rejected the idea that the government can try to limit the speech of some in order to make sure that others are heard. It says, look, that's exactly what the First Amendment's intended to prevent, is the government deciding you've spoken too much, you've got to be quiet. So the egalitarian reason is sort of out the window. But the court has recognized in an effort to prevent corruption of government, you can limit some speech. And that is the reason why we allow limits on campaign contributions, for example. So now the question becomes, how broad can you make those limits go before you're getting into core political speech? In Citizens United, if I can take just another moment here, the decision has been much panned, and of course it allows corporations not to contribute to campaigns, but to make expenditures on their own independently. What should be recognized is that it was the position of the United States government in that case before the Supreme Court was that the government had the power, although they said they wouldn't do it, to limit books and movies and DVDs and transmittal of books by Kindle and so on, if they were political. The government said to a question from Justice Souter that if you had a labor union that wanted to pay somebody to write a pamphlet about labor union rights and how they were important to politics, the government could ban that. They told Justice Roberts that if you had a 500-page book with one sentence advocating the election of a candidate, the government had the authority to ban that. And of course, the case itself was about a movie, a documentary movie. It was kind of a hackneyed documentary hit job against Hillary Clinton, but, it was a documentary movie, that they could ban that. And I think when people realize that radicalism of the government's approach, they understand why the Supreme Court at least felt, boy, we really need to look at this. It may be that folks would still think the Supreme Court got it wrong, but it sheds a little new light on it when we realize the sweeping power government was claiming.
Bruce, did the Supreme Court get it wrong?
No, I think what surprised people about Citizens United was the answering to the question, do corporations have free speech rights? And they said, yes, they do, basically. And I think that was a question that needed to be answered in the political speech context. Do corporations, can they give money to support a particular point of view? And I think a lot of people, reasonable people, could have answered that question differently. But the court said, no, we think corporations do. And it shows the continuation of this broad consensus, as Susan says, this broad, strong reinvigoration of First Amendment protections. There's another case last term, the violent video games case, which you watch some of the stuff and it makes you throw up, except for my children, I don't think.
Who thought it was fine.
Who liked
right.
it, yeah, exactly. Again, the court strikes down a California law trying to prohibit the sale or rental of violent video games to minors, and the court strikes it down. Again, with Scalia dismissing any what so-called scientific evidence that watching a lot of violent video games may have a bad effect and injurious effect on children. And he says, oh, the scientific evidence is completely unreliable and unconvincing. Now, that isn't agreed to by his friend Justice Alito, who says, I'm not so sure. And he does his own, Scalia makes fun of Alito doing his own independent research on violent video games. But Alito, to his credit, goes and watches a lot of these things and then gets a lot of information about where that industry is taking violent video games and says, boy, it's going to be very easy to simulate the real emotional feel of killing people and children. And you're telling me, Justice Scalia, this isn't going to somehow have an effect on a minor? But the court doesn't buy Alito's point of view.
Okay, so here's the popular distinction, or the distinction in the popular mind, which is it may not be unconstitutional.
Right.
But is it helping? is all of this yelling, this screaming, this incivility, this picketing of funerals, this kids killing each other on video screens, is this healthy? And is that, not even whether government should have a role in it, but just we as people, what are the limits we are willing to put on our expression? Start with you, Susan.
Well, I think it is a really important distinction that you're making in a way, right? We've been overwhelmed and deluged in this technology-enabled information revolution, right? And so now, in a way, it does seem to me that this is probably in some way formed the cultural context for these court decisions, right? That it's almost like, well, what can we do, right? We're overwhelmed. I mean, Facebook has 1 billion users. At the rate at which they're producing content, it's almost like we've given up. We're saying, like, we can't do anything about this flood of speech, this flood of information. It's all out there, so now we have to come up with new ways of navigating it. That being said, turning back to Washington, where we began, where this panel really often has its focus, these are uncivil times. They're very partisan times. You can argue that this sort of political disputes as entertainment has become, sort of an explosive force in American political life over the last decade. If that's the sport you're interested in, we have more ways of, giving you the sports coverage, right? 24 hours a day. Politics is sport. And, there's no question these are uncivil times. There's a sense here and in many places in the world, right, that Washington is overwhelmed by dysfunction. It's hard not to disagree with that, although, as my husband will say, and I agree with him too, there's a long history, right, and a long context to partisan fights in Washington. I don't think it's purely a product of Twitter or Facebook or even of the Supreme Court that we have gridlock. Let's remember McCarthyism. Let's remember, the violent political feuds and the media that supported them of the early days of the Republic, right?
Here's the difference. There wasn't any cable. There wasn't a 24-hour industry devoted to keeping the fighting alive.
Right.
And that's what seems to plague us more than the actual fact of the debate.
Yeah.
Peter?
No, I think that's a fair point. And I think that, there ought to be a distinction, as you made the point, about what's legal and what is responsible. I mean, as news media decision makers, whether you're a managing editor of a program or a journalist deciding what to write about, we ought to make choices that are responsible regardless of what government allows us or doesn't allow us to do. And it's true, where there's a proliferation of very harshly worded programs on table, and then they have to get somebody on the right, and they have to get somebody on the left, and everybody's pigeonholed into these little boxes, and heaven forbid anybody have a nuanced view when they're fighting it out. And I get asked to go on some shows, and I ask, well, who else is going to be on? And they have me pigeonholed as being on one of these sides, and I say, no, that's not my role as a reporter. My role as a reporter is I'm happy to come on and give you fact-based thoughts and analysis and observations, but I'm not going to play a role as a partisan participant. Having said that, part of the reason this happens is because there's an audience for it. I mean, the truth of the matter is, yes, we can blame Fox and MSNBC and CNN, and we can blame all those, shouting heads and so forth for debasing our culture and debasing our politics. Well, let's turn them off. I mean, the truth is, they exist because people do watch them, and they have an audience. So how do we solve that problem?
I can tell, as sort of sitting as one who's been on the guest side of that and not a reporter, I remember one episode in particular was during the 2008 campaign when there was some kerfuffle, we'll say, about President Obama receiving possibly foreign donations. And I was on the air and I was saying I didn't really think that was a big problem. And I pointed out that in any large-scale campaign, any large campaign for president takes a certain number of contributions that turn out to be illegal. People just accidentally cross the limit, or they come from a corporation and it's not clear that that's the case or something, and eventually those get refunded and so on. And I could see the host getting visibly more and more upset with me. It's like, you're on this show to represent your side, which is the Obama's the devil, and you've got to go after him for that. And so I do think there's something of a problem there. But I do also think that we do need to be careful and recognize politics has always been tough, as you pointed out. And to me, it's not so much the language, but the tribalism that people don't want to hear other views, what Juan Williams was saying earlier today. I mean, here's just a quote from 30 years ago, and I happened across this literally today as I was reading an article out today. There's evil in the White House. That evil is a man who has no care for the working class. He's cold. He's mean. He has ice water in his veins. That was the sitting Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, talking about Ronald Reagan. I mean, people would say some pretty bad things.
And yet today we say, oh, you know, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan used to have a drink. We talk about how civil that was.
Right.
No, I think that's true. It's funny. I hear it all the time, you know, oh my gosh, look how horrible things they're saying about President Obama. And yes, they do. In fact, we showed the clip, right, of this congressman yelling, "You lie," in the House chamber. Now, I think that's kind of uncivil, and I would hope my child wouldn't grow up to be, you know, uncivil in that kind of atmosphere, but it's hardly new. It's amplified. But Jefferson was called a heathen and an adulterer, and Andrew Jackson was called a bigamist, and Grover Cleveland was talked about his bastard child, and Charles Sumner was beaten on the House of the floor of the Senate, and that's long before George Bush was called Hitler and a liar by the Senate Majority Leader. Harry Reid called him a liar, and Bill Clinton was told by Jesse Helms that he shouldn't visit North Carolina because he wouldn't be safe. I mean, you know, this is not new. What is new, I think, as you say, in the last 20 years, the proliferation, the amplification of it.
Well, there is something else new, and I think it's the unwillingness of many politicians on both sides, not just the extremes, even towards the middle, to compromise. I think, you know, not a couple weeks ago, former Senator Chuck Percy died, and one of the things he was proudest of when he was a senator was his ability to hammer out compromises on legislation between some real lunatics in the Senate, and he did it over and over and over again. There isn't the same willingness to risk political capital, I think, by politicians in compromising, because so many people, whether it's because of cable television or not, I do not know, but are unwilling to have their representatives compromise. And I think that hurts the country. But I'm not sure how much it has to do with First Amendment protections.
You know, I argue with myself a lot about whether it really hurts, about whether people are actually just representing people who have sent them there to be unyielding, to argue a point of view and not budge from it, whether Americans sometimes don't just like it that someone is sticking to their guns. What's your sense of it? Is it healthy? Is it unhealthy for us to have these arguments? And is compromise overrated? Brad?
Well, I think compromise can be healthy. I think we do have some distinctions now. I mean, I think we are really talking about a couple of radically different visions for the country, which make it harder to compromise.
Is this about policy as well as politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a broader consensus for a long time about the general direction of where the country would go. There were certainly arguments about how far, how fast, and how best, but there was a broad consensus that I don't think is there. So I think that's a big part of the difference. I don't think we can underestimate that. But I do go back to this idea that again, there's a somewhat greater sense of tribalism. And it may be the talk shows that, again, bring you on to, you're here to speak for this point of view. Don't agree to the other side at all. You're supposed to represent this side.
Did you ever get invited back?
Not to that show, no. and similarly, the fact that it's kept alive through the blogging, through so many different media outlets, and the ability of people to sort of just get the news that they want to hear, the point of views they want to hear, I think do harden.
Sorry. This is an interesting observation. Sorry, I'm going to be in trouble.
Fight.
It's interesting. In the new era of newspapers, you can click a byline on a website and send the writer a note, right? In the old days, you actually had to take out a pen and paper and write a note to the writer on the New York Times or Washington Post why he stunk. Well, now you can do it very quickly. And what's really fascinating is you get a lot of, bordering on hate mail, sometimes saying you're this or you're that, and somehow often with the same story. I'm both a fascist and a socialist. I'm both pro-Obama and anti-Obama. It's amazing how people will read the same article and come to very different conclusions. But
I find that if you respond and write them back, they always say, "Oh, thank you."
That's what I was going to say.
Can we be friends?
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. I was going to say exactly that. In 2/3 of the times when you write them back and you give them a civil response saying, "Thank you for your opinion. I appreciate your point of view. This is why I said this in the article. This is why I didn't say this, but you're very kind to give me your point of view." 2/3 of the time they back down. They're like, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I'm so glad you made me think about it," because they're not communicating to a person, right? They're communicating to a big, monolithic, impersonal institution. And I think that's driven a lot of the conversation and dialogue in America today, because I'm not the New York Times. I'm a guy who works for the New York Times.
But you also see, and I think if you know this, there's sort of a greater tendency to immediately pigeonhole someone. For example, I teach law at Capital University down in Columbus now. It is a Lutheran institution, and if you know the formal name of the school is the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. Now, it's Lutheran in the way Harvard's Unitarian. I mean, all these colleges had these roots there, but it's not any issue. And I have times where people say, "Oh, he teaches at one of these evangelical colleges," and they immediately use that to pigeonhole into you a category. And I think we see a lot more of that almost the ability to get quick research but not thorough research gives people
I wrote a book that had the name Obama in the title, and before it was even written, people decided I was writing a pro-Obama book. After the book came out, everybody got really quiet because it turned out if they read it at all, when they read it, they discovered it wasn't what they decided it was, and they had to take you out of the pigeonhole. Most people didn't call back and say, "I'm sorry I said that." Susan, I'm sorry, you had something to say.
Well, no, I think this is actually, Brad's made a very important point, which is to say, what's the speech that is most at risk? On some level, right, it's actually not the speech that we're talking about and that we tend to focus on, which is in our super saturated world of opinion and the back and forth. On some level, this consensus about that kind of speech has existed for a long time. The tools may have changed. What concerns me the most is the kind of speech that does cost more money to produce, that's original journalism, that's who's going to be the person who generates the material that the Wikipedia entry is ultimately generated on. And as an editor, I can tell you, my biggest concern is not that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to suddenly get rid of my ability to have people write an opinion piece on my site saying, President Obama has death panels. My guess is that, that's a right that's so long established, it's not going to be a problem. My concern is that the phone rings or the email comes in one day from, the lawyer in Dubai that the Russian oligarch has hired who says, well, you can't just, call me a crook and, I don't care if this guy has a trail of, bodies and intrigue a mile wide, we're going to bankrupt you, or we're going to, in this globalized era of information, who's going to do the original reporting that's going to tell you about that? And I think that, to me, is where I would like to see more of the free speech conversation rest in. And that's a money thing, but it's also, in a way, the other side of this Citizens United conversation, because in my experience as an editor, that kind of free speech has a heavy privilege, the better your credit card. And it is weighted and biased towards those with enormous sums of money, some of which are lavished on law firms and PR firms and that sort of thing. And, it's not a kind of phone call that you get from an NGO in Brazil saying, oh, you've misrepresented our work. Their free speech isn't going to be an issue.
Susan has turned us in the direction for my final question before I open the floor to your questions and to the questions from our tweeters. And Bruce, I'll start with you, which is, we know what's gone wrong. What goes right? How do we turn it right?
I think Susan is dead on about the importance of fact-based reporting. A few years ago, somebody, as the blogosphere was developing, somebody in my office said to me, boy, there are going to be so many libel cases on the internet now. And I said, no, they're not, because there's so little facts. Mm-hmm. Everybody's got millions of opinions, but they're so, and libel and defamation is all about false facts. There isn't any such thing as a false opinion. And believe me, we got lots of opinions on the internet, but not much fact-based journalism and reporting. And so I think that is the critical question, and how to do that and how to see more of it. I think it will come as the internet ripens. As people get sick of reading other people's opinions and maybe hunger for a little bit more meat, beef.
It's so sweet of you to think so.
I'm an optimist.
Brad, and then Peter, and then we'll start to take your questions.
Okay. Well, I don't know that I have too much to ask for. I do think it's a whole cultural atmosphere. For example, even, I talk to more kids who are in lower grades in schools who are taught in an effort to encourage them to be expressive, that their opinions are all fine. Everybody's opinion is equal. And I think ultimately that becomes a somewhat destructive idea against the notion of facts, of expertise. We shouldn't cower in front of experts, but I think we should respect people who've put a lot of time and energy into things. Not all opinions are equal. And I think politically, I think we need to spend a lot less time thinking that, and this may contradict what I just said, but thinking that you can judge an argument simply by who is speaking, which I see just happen all the time, and indeed is repeatedly emphasized. There's this idea that we need to know who's speaking, we need to know who's behind this. And I always remember that the Federalist Papers were signed anonymously, in part so that people would have to grapple with the arguments therein and not just attack the speakers. So I think there's a whole host of things that go beyond that, and it's going to take some while, I think, to get back to a better level of debate, with that cautionary note that we shouldn't idealize the level that debate was ever at.
We now turn to, Peter, I'm sorry, final thought.
I guess I would just end with the thought that what Susan has raised as the future of journalism, to some extent, is a very valid and important issue. And you've heard a lot probably in the last couple of years about the problems in the business, newspapers that have cut back their coverage and bureaus that have closed and so forth. And all of those are real and very, very troubling in a lot of ways. I would offer one last thought, though, that there's also reason for optimism about fact-based journalism, that there is, in fact, in this new technology, the hope for the future, that there are new ways of telling stories, new ways of gathering information. Susan's site, foreignpolicy.com, didn't exist, essentially, when we were growing up as a news vehicle. Today, you can go to it and others like it and find a lot more information than you ever were able to do in the past. You're not reliant just on, I hate to say, the New York Times or the Washington Post, and that there are, in fact, a proliferation of new and exciting possibilities in journalism that hopefully will flower over the years to come.
Thank you. Now, there are microphones. I think you must all know where they are by now, and we're anxious to take your questions. So I'd like to take a question from the audience, and a couple of questions from the audience, then we'll turn to our Twitter stream. Well, we'll turn there first if you're all unmoved. Okay. There's a very good questions I've already seen here. While you all get your questions together in your heads, we'll turn to that. Where'd it go? Someone asks, the courts ask what constitutes free speech? What constitutes speech? My thoughts, shouldn't the question always be what doesn't constitute speech? Bruce?
I'm not sure. What doesn't?
What doesn't constitute speech?
Well, the Supreme Court has been moving away from categories, outright categories like obscenity or false speech, essentially, that are unprotected by the Constitution. So that the direct answer is that the Supreme Court's not going that way. There was some thought a few years ago that they would start creating new categories. Justice Breyer, for instance, in dissenting in the violent video games case, says he thinks that it was not about censorship, it was about education, and he would have created a whole new category of protection of children. Whenever anything involves protection of children, that kind of speech could be unprotected and regulated much more. Now, nobody agreed with him, and the violent video game people were very upset with him. Sir.
Hi. Charles Patton here. There is a quote from one of the justices in the Supreme Court where he was defining obscenity. He said he didn't know what it was, but he knew it when he saw it. I'm wondering, who on the panel can defend Hank Williams for his comments about President Obama using the Westboro case as doctrine to say Hank was saying what he felt? He didn't see it as being offensive. His right to free speech, just like the people protesting the funerals for the soldiers, is their right to free speech.
So
the question is, was Hank offensive enough to restrict his right to free speech? And who on the panel using the Westboro decision can use that justification to defend Hank Williams and say he has a right to do that?
Bruce is
I find out who really reads which sections of the New York Times when I was quoted in the New York Times last Friday on the Hank Williams speech, and I got all these emails from people saying, great quote. What I basically said was, like a lot of talented songwriters, Mr. Williams has a big mouth. And he was talking, but I don't think we should pounce on him for not being a constitutional lawyer. He said that ESPN was sort of stepping on the toes of the First Amendment. Well, I said, yeah, I think that ESPN was trying to discourage his free speech, and they certainly did, and they're certainly entitled to do that. As a private company, they do not have to hire him to sing on the kickoffs, because they don't have to hire a tone-deaf, what I called him, a tone-deaf Politico. I was going to call him a 16-wheeler wingnut, but I'm glad that I only called him a tone-deaf Politico. So, but ESPN doesn't have to hire him, just because he says something ridiculous like he did.
Okay. But for the debate, he has a right to say that.
Of course, no one's going to prosecute him for comparing President Obama
he can say it on
to Hitler.
street corners and not be compensated by ESPN to say it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, I have another question here coming from our Twitter feed. I'm having so much fun. I feel so high tech. Let's see. Someone's complaining about the stream. That's me. Someone's quoting me. Okay, we're going to go back out here to the other questions until we find a better one.
First of all, welcome to all the panelists, Ms. Ifill. I'm a local elected official, and we're always questioned, and I represent an area that is parts of it impoverished area. And the ultimate question, when we always hang our hat on the free speech in our society, and whether free speech is effective speech, and when does free speech get drowned out by the money and the power? And I think that's what's going on in Wall Street, that ultimately we can continue to say folks in our society has free speech, but the truth of the matter is that money and power in much of our society overrules whether that speech is effective, whether it's heard, and whether the media, particularly the entertainment part of the media, is really supposed to be the balancing of those who don't have the power of money to be heard, if not equally, but sufficiently.
Well, let me just draw one line before I let the panelists, which is we don't know anything about the entertainment part of the media. I mean, they don't have any responsibility to provide all sides of an issue. They're there to entertain. That's their business imperative and their business model. So that's why Hank Williams doesn't matter to me. But what happens on programs that say they are about news matters to me, and then that's where your question then becomes a good one.
Well, one of the first things I think that's important to bear in mind, I think there's very little evidence that voices are drowned out in American politics. Obviously, if you have more money, you can get your message out to a larger audience. But you take, for example, the Tea Party a couple of years ago, or you take now Occupy Wall Street, both of them, the presence of money and the addition of money into the movement amplified those voices. We would probably still never have heard of Occupy Wall Street were it weren't for the fact that people began to put money into it, that the labor unions decided they were going to get behind it, that elements of the Democratic Party decided they were going to get behind it. And we see that throughout history. There's also very little evidence that the political opinion of those who are not terribly active in politics differ substantially from those who are terribly active. So I do challenge that assumption of your question that money kind of rules all and sets the agenda in the political arena. I think that if we really look at it objectively, voices do get heard. And maybe how you've got to get heard if you don't have the cash is you go do Occupy Wall Street, or you go to the Tea Party and hope somebody with money finds you. But, we normally would think of, for example, President Obama as appealing more to the lower class, but he raised more money from people earning over $250,000 a year than did his Republican opponents. So the effects of money in politics are very complex, and it is simply a big mistake to think money and power and they just go together and they rule everything. That is simply, it's a much more complex issue than that.
I have to say, I do find it interesting that when the Tea Party first came to prominence, many people dismissed them as being disorganized, without leadership, and they just got up there and talked, and no one knew that no one had a common goal. And that's the same thing that we were saying about the Occupy Wall Street people for the first couple of weeks, and now we'll wait and see whether they turn into an actual cohesive movement.
I just totally disagree, and I think it's naive to believe that money has not hijacked the concept of free speech, particularly in an impoverished area. We might hang our hat on it, like we got cameras in Wall Street, but throughout our country, throughout our neighborhoods, the inner city, for example, the increase of violence and the lack of the voicing of the voices within there. So I would just disagree based on my own experience as a local leader that money has drowned it out significant parts of our community. And in fact, the culture, entertainment actually speaks to the fact that it's saying those voices that normally cannot be heard. So we'll agree to disagree.
Well, we can, but if I were to do a very brief comeback, it would be that typically, for example, what poor people who don't have a lot of money to get their message out need are rich people. And in fact, that's the alliance that has often been most effective for change. Remember, we got Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and the Voting Rights Act and a lot of things we view as great liberal triumphs in America in a day when people could walk into a congressman's office with a sack of cash. I mean, I'm not suggesting that that's the ideal necessarily, but I just think it's that I guess you said, my experience is this. Well, my experience looking at money in a bigger picture is no. So, yeah, we'll agree to disagree.
You guys can take this out in the lobby. Ma'am.
Hi, my name is Jessica Williams. I'm a library school student at Kent State, and I just wanted to comment and ask your opinions about why so many decisions have been going up into the Supreme Court about morality issues, like things that normally, like the video game case, where that's sort of like there are these laws, but isn't it the decision of parents to decide what their children view? I mean, it's a big issue for me because of last week was Banned Books Week in libraries across the country, and that's like the whole
it's a good question, Jessica, which is what point does government overstep and take over the role that should be controlled in the home? People have that question. Anybody want to weigh in on it? No?
One of the lawyers?
Oh, come on, the lawyers have to. The journalists are always in favor of the ban.
I think the simple answer to your question is legislatures are passing laws that regulate speech, and then they get tested. This term at the Supreme Court, it is indecent how long it's taken, but we are going to get a constitutional test of the FCC's ridiculous enforcement rules on indecency on broadcast television when there's all this virtual porn on cable, and they're probably going to be struck down because they are ridiculous. And you can see where I'm coming from in this. I think the Supreme Court is going to be exactly the same place. But it's because the FCC decided after Janet Jackson's wardrobe malfunction and a brief fleeting moment of nudity on NYPD Blue. Does anyone remember that program any longer?
It was a fine program.
Yeah, it was a good show. But, I mean, it's gone. It's been gone for so long, and it's taken about 7 years to get this test case up to the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. But they're not going to stop as long as Congress and legislatures stop passing unconstitutional laws.
It does have to start somewhere. I have another question, a good question here on the Twitter. The question is, do you think the free speech / politics issue would be improved if we limited campaigns to 90 days? Peter?
Well, people often...
We would be out of work.
We would be out of work. I have nothing to do. 4 years Full Employment Act for journalists is the current campaign structure. Look, I mean, Britain obviously and other countries have similar rules like that. They limit the campaigns, and it's very appealing. You can completely see why we would all just like to have a nice, quick election period. I don't think it's hard for me to imagine the lawyers would not get to the Supreme Court pretty fast in that case with a challenge saying that the government cannot restrict candidates from appealing to voters outside of a 90-day window. I mean, there are some time limits, I think, already in terms of changing how we regulate certain television advertising and so forth within a certain amount of days of elections or whatever, right? I mean, I think there's something like that. But the fact of the matter is, let's just say we had a law that said no campaigning outside 90 days. How do you define what campaigning is? If a politician, where's our local official here, if he goes to a town hall meeting because he wants to meet his constituents, is that campaigning? If he gets up and has an ad on TV and says, I'm for this bill because this bill is important, and I'm Joe Blow and I'm your councilman, is that campaigning? So I think it's very hard to find a way to do that.
It's a rule crying for a loophole.
Yeah.
We're going to take as many more questions as we can in just a few more minutes, so if we can keep the questions and the answers concise, sir.
Yes, I'd like to suggest that it's not really free speech we're talking about, it's communication on a very broad level and a kind of breakdown, not only of giving information, but receiving information. And I'd like to point out one wonderful program called News Literacy, which is being taught at Stony Brook University to educate undergraduates and graduate students in how to read the media, how to understand this hugely proliferating welter of information that people get, how to analyze it for truthfulness, for accountability, and so forth. And I do think the education system, both high school and college, could do more in this area. I'm speaking to the points of Susan Baker and Peter. Susan and Peter.
I completely endorse that. I'm actually involved in a news literacy project, which you can follow on Twitter, which is all about the idea of distinguishing between information and news. We're raising a generation of young people who don't know the difference and don't make the distinction and just think anything that they see on their cell phone must be true, or the first entry on Wikipedia must be so. And we know that we require a lot more than that. I appreciate that. Thank you. Sir.
Okay, you raised the issue of the closing of a lot of newspapers, the closing of news bureaus, the cutback in budgets in the major networks for bureaus and things. We get opinion every place, but where are we going to get the responsible, ethical journalism that goes all over the world, all over the country, and gets the facts, the real facts, digs, investigates, and gets that information, the accurate information to us?
Right. It's a great question. I'm jumping in here. Susan can definitely give you a better answer. I think it's a huge quandary, I think, right now in our business. When we were in Moscow, we were there for the Washington Post. The New York Times was there, the Philadelphia Inquirer was there, New York Newsday was there, Chicago Tribune was there, Boston Globe was there, Christian Science Monitor was there, LA Times was there, Wall Street Journal. Today, it's only 2 or 3 papers. It's only the Times Post and Journal, I think. And the rest of them are gone. And the overall aggregate number of foreign bureaus held open by American news organizations has dwindled, even as the last decade has shown how important international news is to us here in the United States. And that's a tremendous challenge right now for the news industry. I'll tell you why, though. It costs, I'm going to make this number up because I've got it wrong, but it's something like $1 million a year to have a bureau in Baghdad. Probably more, actually, for the New York Times because they had more reporters there. And you have all the security, and you have to make sure you've paid the guys with guns, frankly, and the armored cars. And it's an expensive thing. It's not easy. And so what you're seeing, I think, is more guerrilla journalism, which Susan can talk about, where you have people and news sites that are beginning to spring up that may not be traditional, but are providing information in a way that we never used to have before.
Well, that's right. I think I would disagree with Peter in the sense that, it's very easy to sort of wail and say, oh no, the world as we know it is no longer, and that's true. Why would international news coverage be any different than everything else that's been subjected to an absolute revolution in the way we get information? There has been a revolution, yes. Some pockets of journalism have been a little bit slower than others to get the news, right? And where I would say is, that's true. It's not necessarily the case that it was the best model that you had before. There might have been more bureaus, but it's also true that it was wasteful and duplicative. And you had the Chicago Tribune and New York Newsday and the Boston Globe and the Washington Post and the New York Times all writing the same story. Maybe there was a 10 or 15% difference. And the story mostly revolved around, Gwen Ifill said yesterday. And so how much value was being added to that? How much, was that really the only model for Americans to receive their news about the world? So I wouldn't necessarily be focused on, sort of moaning about what was lost. The question that I think is a very important question is, how are we going to most take advantage of these incredible new tools? And really, I am a techno-optimist. I think anybody who thinks about the proliferation of information, anyone who is in any way connected with news, with information, with writing, with thinking about the world, this is a golden age. These tools that we're using to have this conversation today are revolutionary in the positive sense. So I would take heart from that, and I think that includes the future of independent journalism and reporting. Never before have you people sitting here in Cleveland had the ability to have more access to better information and original reporting, by the way, instantly, in your bedroom at 2 o'clock in the morning, sitting here in the back of the theater because we're boring you. This is a golden age for information and journalism. However, I hope that if you're not already paying for it, you're going to start paying for it. So please do. The New York Times has already put their paywall on. You can still get my site for free for now. But what contributions, as they say, right, are welcome.
Well, I think that's actually a very nice way to sum up what we've been talking about here today, because we want to remain optimists. The secret isn't whether speech should be protected, and the secret isn't whether speech is valuable. The secret is how do we manage our speech, what controls do we put and not put in our speech, and how do we value it. I want you to join me in thanking this fabulous panel.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.